Hi, I'm Shuli Elisheva. I am a Yiddish teacher, poet, composer in Providence, Rhode Island. And I did not grow up speaking Yiddish. So if any of you ever think that you are learning Yiddish as an adult and you'll never learn Yiddish as an adult because you can't teach old dogs new tricks and all of that, well, I started learning Yiddish in 2009 and I am fluent in Yiddish. I speak Yiddish with my 6-year-old from the day that they were born. Although, as 6-year-olds often do, sometimes refuses to speak Yiddish with me, which is actually a lot of the time, but I do Yiddish. And I read novels in Yiddish and I write in Yiddish. So you should never think that because you started as an adult, it's too late. It's never too late. So I'm very excited for all of you that you're learning Yiddish, and I'm so excited you're here to learn even more about Yiddish. So I want to ask you to imagine for a moment that you were in charge of doing an absolutely ridiculous thing, which is creating a Duolingo course yourself for English. And the question is, would you use British English or would you use American English? Right? Which one would you use? It's a question. Of course, the Australians would be saying, why aren't you talking about Australian English? But this is basically the decision that had to be made when creating YIVO Yiddish, because there are multiple dialects of Yiddish. But it's even more complicated than that, because suppose that you were to say, okay, well, we'll make an American English course. Well, what pronunciation are you going to use? Are you going to use a New York accent? Are you going to use a Southern accent? Will you use a Valley Girl accent or a Boston accent, right? Whatever language you choose, whatever dialect you choose, there are always many different pronunciations. Depending on what kind of English you're talking about, there will be different word choices. You know, if I have like a can of Coke, call that a soda or a pop or a soda pop or a soft drink or a Coke, even if it's a Pepsi, right? These are all questions that have to be decided. So I mention all of this because when the creators of Duolingo, of the Duolingo Yiddish course, created a poll asking people what dialect they should use, it actually created flame wars on Twitter, if you can believe it. I was part of those flame wars. So I know from firsthand experience that people got really angry just about the very fact that somebody would ask what dialect to use for Duolingo Yiddish. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the dialect that's used for Duolingo Yiddish. In fact, I call it Duolingo Yiddish rather than Satmar Hasidic Yiddish, and I'll explain to you why. But before I actually tell you what the differences are, their pronunciation differences, we'll go through all the vowels and everything, and the spelling and everything. But before we do that, I want to tell you a little bit about the history of so-called standard Yiddish, and the history of the dialect that was chosen for Duolingo, because it's not simply a theoretical choice of what dialect do we choose. There's so much language, there's so much identity caught up in how we speak language and how we use language and what spelling we use and what pronunciation we use. You know, it would not be beyond the pale, so to speak, when talking about Duolingo Yiddish, to keep in mind the linguistic racism in America when Blacks are told your pronunciation is wrong, it's not standard English, or your grammar is wrong, or your spelling is wrong because it's not standard. That's essentially what Hasidim have been told for 100 years by the so-called Yiddishists who came up with the standard Yiddish system, who basically told the Hasidim, your spelling is wrong, your words are fake Yiddish, they're not authentic Yiddish. And in turn, Hasidim were telling the academics who created the standard Yiddish, your words are fake, you're a fake dialect, and your spelling is wrong, and all of this. And all of this came to a head with these flame wars on Twitter. So let's talk a little bit about the background of these, and then I'll tell you about the pronunciation differences, and also how, in fact, creating Duolingo Yiddish using one kind of pronunciation undermines the spelling system that they decide to use from a different dialect. So we'll talk about that. It's all very fascinating. So before we do that, why don't you just put into the chat box here, what is your level with Yiddish? Would you describe yourself as a total beginner? would you describe yourself as advanced, as a fluent speaker, as a heritage speaker? Where are you all coming from? Beginner, total beginner, intermediate beginner, lower intermediate, total beginner. All right, so we've got sort of a range here. Fluent and advanced, learning quickly, yeshiva Orthodox background, native. All right. So we've got ranging from total beginner to native, and we've got somebody here who's a total beginner in Yiddish, but a native speaker of German. Middle, great, beginner, intermediate, German is native tongue. All right, so we've got a diverse group here, and hopefully it should be diverse enough that I should be able to anger just about every one of you in some way or another, and also excite every one of you in some way or another. Sadie knows his phrases, but not grammar. Okay, so let's talk a bit about Yiddish. So Yiddish, as you may know, or perhaps you might not know, Yiddish is about 1,000 years old. It got started in among German-speaking Jews in Europe, and as the German-speaking Jews eventually migrated to Eastern Europe, then it started being not just a mix of German and Hebrew, but then there was a lot of Slavic grammar and vocabulary that was thrown into mix, and eventually came to be this very complicated, very unique language, a very complicated, unique language that, like many languages, was not standardized. Right? There are many different spellings. There were many different pronunciations. There were a lot of different variants on the grammar. If you ever try and read old Jewish gravestones and try to make out the spelling of names, it's oftentimes, there are so many different spellings of names because it wasn't standardized. But about 100 years ago, there were these academics, somehow it always comes down to academics, who decided we should standardize the Yiddish language. Why? Because we want to have Yiddish newspapers, and we want to have Yiddish radio, and we want to know what Yiddish to use. And not only that, but we want to teach Yiddish courses, and we want to have Yiddish textbooks, and we want Yiddish to be recognized at universities. And what Yiddish are we going to use? 100 years ago, the Yiddish-speaking world looked very different, of course, than it does today. 100 years ago, most Yiddish speakers were in Eastern Europe, and there were three primary dialects of Yiddish. The Jews who were in Poland mostly spoke what came to be known as Polish Yiddish, and those who were in Lithuania spoke what became known as Lithuanian Yiddish, and those in Ukraine, spoke Ukrainian Yiddish. And of course, the borders were always, changing, and it was more complicated than that. But there were these three major dialects. And there was a big question, which one should be used? Should it be Lithuanian Yiddish? Should that be what's taught in Yiddish classes? Should it be Polish Yiddish? Should it be Ukrainian Yiddish? And it gets even more complicated than that because, of course, within these dialects, there are many sub-dialects, right? And various accents. So the researchers at an institution called YIVO, which is the Yiddish Wissenschaftliche Institute in Vilna, decided they would come up with a standard system. And what they did was very interesting. They decided that they were going to mostly use Lithuanian Yiddish pronunciation, mostly, and they would mostly use Polish Yiddish grammar and spelling, mostly, and the Ukrainian Yiddish speakers were mostly left out of the mix. And it was just enough to please everybody, but it was also enough to anger everybody, right? Because the Lithuanian Jews said, great, so you're using our pronunciation, but you're totally mixing up the grammar. And the Polish Jews said, great, you're using our grammar, but you're totally mixing up the pronunciation. And this is a big deal because, I don't know about you, I've never been a college sports fan, but when I was a student at the University of Michigan, I knew enough to know that if you went to Ohio State University, you were not welcome at the University of Michigan. There would be people with signs around. It was very impolite, I suppose, to have signs saying all sorts of derogatory things about the Buckeyes from Ohio State University. So instead they said things about the Fuckeyes of Osai. Like there's a lot of tension here, a lot of identity. And this is very much the tension between Lithuanian Yiddish and Polish Yiddish, right? There were a lot of not just linguistic tensions, but cultural tensions as well. The Lithuanian Jews were stereotyped as being very, very serious, very academic, very intellectual, very strict, whereas the Polish Jews were stereotyped as being very hippie-ish and being, sort of not being so much into the books, being more into dancing and singing, and so when the language was standardized, right, the identities were very much a part of that. So fast forward 100 years, and the world of Yiddish looks very different today. Most Yiddish speakers don't live in Eastern Europe and haven't for a really long time. The standard narrative is that Yiddish died when it left Eastern Europe, but the truth of the matter is Yiddish never died, it just changed. And over the course of the past 100 years, 50, 60 years in particular, so much of the Yiddish world has migrated from Eastern Europe to places like New York City, Montreal, Melbourne, Australia, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, London. In all of these places around the world, Yiddish began to take root in ways that it hadn't before, and to such an extent that now there is, in fact, a lot of new Yiddish literature being published, including picture books for babies and comic books and novels and so forth, but they're not being published in Eastern Europe. They're being published in New York City or in Jerusalem, or of all places in Sweden, where Yiddish is a national minority language. And so when it came time to create this Duolingo course, right, the question was, what do we use? There were a lot of questions. Do we use Polish Yiddish? Do we use Lithuanian Yiddish? Do we use Ukrainian Yiddish? But the truth is, those are kind of old-fashioned labels by now, because if you want to talk about dialects today, well, there's the standard Yiddish called YIVO Yiddish. There's also various kinds of Hasidic Yiddish that are spoken in New York and Jerusalem primarily. There's the so-called Satmar Hasidic Yiddish, which actually has its origins in Hungarian Yiddish. And there's Babaver Yiddish, and there are all kinds, and there's the Chabad Yiddish, which is very similar to Litvish Yiddish. And so the question is, what do we use? And the creators of Duolingo decided, let's create a poll, and there were the flame wars and so on and so forth. So I should tell you now what the differences are, but I haven't really told you all that much about Hasidic Yiddish. The dialect in Duolingo is Hasidic Yiddish. It's specifically Satmar Yiddish, which is from Hungary. And so I'm going to go through the differences are primarily in terms of the vowels. And I'm going to tell you, so like, here's the difference in this letter and this letter and this letter. Here's how they're all different. But the truth of the matter is that before I tell you that, even, I have to tell you a little bit of a secret, which is that when Duolingo Yiddish uses Satmar Hasidic pronunciation, but standard Yiddish spelling, the pronunciation actually completely undermines the spelling, and the spelling completely undermines the pronunciation in ways that have actually confused a lot of my students who are using Duolingo, and a lot of other people who aren't my students, but who I know and are really struggling. And the problem is this, that one of the hallmarks of standard Yiddish, what the researchers at YIVO created with the standard Yiddish, they decided that they wanted Yiddish to be entirely phonetic. Every letter should have one sound. Every sound should have one letter. It should be easy to spell, easy to pronounce. And to a certain extent, they accomplished that. The truth is that when Yiddish teachers like to tell their students, every letter has one sound, every sound has one letter. Actually not true, even with standard YIVO Yiddish. It's like 95% true, but it's mostly true, right? Every letter has one sound, every sound has one letter. Well, that's not true with Satmar Hasidic Yiddish. And so the pronunciation that you're learning in Duolingo it doesn't match the phonetic system of YIVO Yiddish. So if you have experience with YIVO Yiddish, and I know many of you might not if you're a total beginner, but many of you who have experience with YIVO Yiddish might be thinking, but this letter is supposed to be pronounced phonetically, and why now are these two letters pronounced the same way? And why now are these two different sounds represented by the same letter? It can be very confusing. And so that's why before I tell you what the actual differences are, I want to make sure that you understand that this is actually confusing, right? And it's confusing because of the compromises that were made in order to please everybody while pleasing nobody. And it's not just you. So let's talk about the differences. I'm just peeking over into the chat box here. Somebody asks, it's a bit confusing, but hey, which language isn't? Esperanto. I'm sure that you will find disagreements among Esperanto speakers as well, I am sure. But it's true. This is true of so many languages. When I was learning Russian years ago, I remember taking the phonetics classes and the teacher telling us that Tchaikovsky's name is not actually pronounced Tchaikovsky, it's actually pronounced Tchaikovsky. And I couldn't believe it. And I asked my Russian friends and I Googled, and yes, in Russian, there are many different pronunciations, just like in English, there are many different pronunciations. In Hebrew, there are many different pronunciations. I can't say in all languages because I don't know all languages, but I would dare to suggest that probably in most languages, that's the case. So thank you, Rena Lay. I'm glad that you're finding this very well organized and clear. I am very glad to hear that. Connor is saying that it sounds very much like what your grandparents spoke, and you're content with that. Satmar Hasidic Yiddish, like most Hasidic Yiddish today, is actually very similar in a lot of ways to Polish Yiddish, or so-called Galiciana Yiddish, which is what a lot of our grandparents and great-grandparents spoke. And so I hear that. A lot of people are hearing that. And also I know a lot of people who are very angry about the Duolingo stuff. So let's try and create some understanding here. So I'm going to share my screen just to put up a little whiteboard here. And I'm going to be writing the letters in Yiddish using the Yiddish alphabet. If you don't know the alphabet, it's fine. We're learning. And I'll try and do it in a way that you'll still be able to follow. So in Yiddish, one of the major differences between Hebrew and Yiddish is that Yiddish actually has vowels that are letters, unlike Hebrew, which doesn't really have vowels. It has vowels, but they're not like vowels as most languages have them. But Yiddish has these vowels. So we have what's called Pasich Aleph. And let me see if I can make this bigger. No, all right, well, we'll just leave it at that because they're a bunch of letters. Okay, so there's Pasich Aleph, there's Kometz Aleph, there's Ayin, there's Yud, two Yuds with a line underneath them. There's Vav, there's Vav Yud. There are probably some others too, but these are the big ones. So how are these pronounced? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these, I'm going to put them here on the side, and I'm going to write here in English. So YIVO Yiddish, which is what has been the standard Yiddish for about 100 years, and Duo Lingo Yiddish, which again I'm calling Duo Lingo Yiddish rather than Satmar Hasidic Yiddish, because even though the pronunciation is Satmar, the grammar and the spelling are not. It's really, I mean, the creators of Duolingo did exactly what the creators of YIVO Yiddish did 100 years ago by combining multiple dialects. So here we go. So let's go through this. Let's do a turn there. Okay, so the first letter, this is like the bonus. Pasach Aleph in YIVO Yiddish is pronounced A, and in Duolingo Yiddish is also pronounced A. So there, we can start with one that actually is the same in both dialects, but then it gets different from there. Let's just move this down so it's a little bit more aligned. Okay, Kometz Aleph in YIVO Yiddish is pronounced O. Kometz Aleph O. And in Duolingo Yiddish, it is pronounced U. Kometz Aleph U. YIVO Yiddish ayin is pronounced eh, and in Duolingo Yiddish is pronounced a. So and it's notable here that I'm using the standard transliteration created by YIVO. Standard Hasidic transliteration would be EI rather than EY. So even the transliteration, there are some differences, but I believe that Duolingo uses the standard Yiddish, the standard YIVO version of the transliteration, so we'll stick with that for now. Yud in YIVO Yiddish is pronounced either E or I, as in bit or bean, depending on the context. And Duolingo Yiddish also, sometimes bit, sometimes bean, though Duolingo Yiddish tends to be more the I sound like in bit rather than the E sound in bean, but you do get both. So that and the Pasach Aleph are the bonus ones. The two Yuds in YIVO Yiddish is pronounced A, and in Duolingo Yiddish is pronounced I. The two Yuds with the Pasach underneath them, the line underneath them, in YIVO Yiddish is pronounced I, and in Duolingo Yiddish is pronounced Ah. So you can see why this is confusing for a lot of people. The Vav in YIVO Yiddish is pronounced U. In Duolingo Yiddish, it's pronounced I. Sometimes E, but mostly I. And then the Vav Yud in YIVO Yiddish is pronounced Oi, as in the famous word Oive. And in Duolingo Yiddish is generally pronounced O. These differences are general. There are times when the vowels are pronounced slightly differently than this. Sometimes they're more similar, sometimes they're more different. But this is a generalization. So if you're writing this down, this will be a very helpful chart. I can also make this available after the Zoom is over. I'll be making a recording of this. Assuming this is actually recording. Is this actually recording? I thought it was recording. Well, we shall see. If it's not recording, then it won't be available. But I'll make something if it isn't recorded. So this is in general the differences. There are also differences between. Well, before I talk about that, so what's the deal here? I said that this pronunciation undermines the spelling and so forth because it's Hasidic pronunciation, but YIVO spelling. So as I said, one of the hallmarks of YIVO Yiddish is that it's entirely phonetic, like 95% phonetic, right? Every letter has one sound, every sound has one letter, 95%, right? So you can see A, O, E, A, I, U, Oi, right? There's, but take a look here in Duolingo Yiddish where Pasach Aleph, A, and Pasach Tzva Yidden, also I, right? Also ah, right? So you've got ah here and you've got ah there, right? Look here, you've got the yud in Duolingo Yiddish is pronounced I, and also the vav is pronounced I, right? So this hallmark of standard Yiddish spelling, that it's phonetic, every letter one sound, every sound has one letter, doesn't work with Satmar Hasidic Yiddish. But the spelling that's used in Duolingo is the spelling system that assumes that it's all phonetic, right? So Hasidic Yiddish spelling is actually very different in many ways than YIVO Yiddish spelling. If you were to read a Yiddish newspaper, a Hasidic Yiddish newspaper, the spelling would be very different than it would be in a typical textbook, for example. Or if you were to pick up a picture book published in the Hasidic world or a Hasidic comic book, the spelling is likely to be very different than what you would encounter in, say, the Yiddish Vorwärts, which is one of the major Yiddish newspapers today. So this is another thing that, if you have experience with YIVO Yiddish, could be very confusing for you. I've had some of my own students get very confused by this and say, but wait a minute, why is this pronounced this way and spelled this way. I thought it was supposed to be phonetic and it's not phonetic. Well, this is why, because the spelling assumes that it's phonetic, but the pronunciation is not the phonetic pronunciation. So another important thing to keep in mind. So that's basically what I wanted to share with you. There are other differences between YIVO Yiddish and Satmar Hasidic Yiddish, which is what Duolingo is based on, in terms of grammar and spelling. In general, the Hasidic grammar is much less consistent than YIVO standard Yiddish is. Because I have a 6-year-old who speaks Yiddish, I have tons and tons of picture books, mostly from the Hasidic world. And if you're familiar with the ways that Yiddish nouns are gendered, where there are feminine nouns and masculine nouns and gender neutral nouns, unless you're from Lithuania, for some reason, the Lithuanian Jews really liked binary genders and they don't have the gender, the gender neutral gender. Everything is masculine or feminine, go figure. But outside of the Litvak world, right, there are the 3 grammatical genders. And so sometimes you would refer to a word as der or as die or as dos. Well, in Satmar Yiddish, it's not really so consistent. Everything is just sort of di, and you might find in a book where one and the same word is sometimes referred to as if it were a masculine word, and sometimes it's referred to as if it were a feminine word. But the grammar you're learning in Duolingo is the very consistent, very structured, very academic version created by YIVO. So again, that's something to keep in mind. Something that can be very frustrating for a lot of Yiddish students who learn YIVO Yiddish and then try and read Hasidic Yiddish, get very confused because the Hasidic Yiddish doesn't follow the grammar rules that students were taught in their university courses or in textbooks or at summer programs. And Hasidic speakers who are maybe native in Yiddish then get flack from Yiddishists who say, but your grammar is terrible, right? Like, why aren't you being consistent? So again, there are a lot of things to keep in mind here because Duolingo is not using a specific dialect, because it's a mix of dialects, basically creating a 21st century version of YIVO Yiddish. So I see that there are some things in the chat box here. I'm just going to take a look at that. Deborah took a screenshot. Yes, I'm so glad. If anybody else wants to take a screenshot, feel free to take a screenshot of this. Sadie says that explanation of the spelling makes so much sense and reconciles why I felt able to naturally pronounce what I read, but it didn't sound correct. So most Satmar speakers make every noun feminine. Yeah, that's the joke, right? Like Satmar Hasidim are the most feminist of the Yiddish speakers, right? They make everything feminine. I mean, it's not really that way. There's still a lot of der. There's still a lot of dos. You wouldn't refer to tata, father, as like di tata, right? It would always be der tata, right? And you'd never refer to the mother as der mama, right? It would always be di mama. But it is a lot more, I suppose you could say, grammatically gender fluid in the Hasidic world than it is in the secular academic world. Deborah's asking, can you put up other Satmar spellings on the chart too? Yes. So I will do that in just a moment. I'm going to open up for a Q&A session, and that'll be the first thing that I'll do in the Q&A. Before I do that, I'm going to close this. But if you haven't screenshotted it or you haven't written it down, I will make it available later. I'm just going to stop the screen share for a moment. And before we go into the Q&A, where you'll have chances to ask all your questions and raise all of your complaints and all of your quizzical queries and compliments and whatever it is you want to put into the chat box, some of you might be thinking, maybe most of you I would venture to guess, maybe not all of you, but some of you might be thinking, hey, this Shuli Elisheva person seems to know a thing or two about Yiddish. I wonder if I could learn more about Yiddish from her. And if that's what you're thinking, then I would love to invite you to visit my website. I have a website, which is creativeshuli@gmail.com. I'll put that in the chat box here. Creative Shuli, or I'll capitalize creativeshuli.com. And I have on there, I'm a Yiddish poet, so I've put a lot of my poetry on there. I am transgender, and I have written a lot of poetry about being transgender in Yiddish, and I have that on my website with English translations. I've also done webinars on Yiddish fantasy literature, which is a particular love of mine. In fact, I just began reading a book called Erev der Vierte Weltmilchama, Hines, Königin von Mars, on the eve of World War IV, Queen of Mars. So I'm really into this stuff, and I have vocabulary lists on my website, fantasy and sci-fi. I have excerpts from Yiddish fantasy and sci-fi literature on my website, so you can find a lot of things there. You might also be thinking, okay, so she has a website and she has students, but what if I just really appreciated this lecture today, and I just really want to financially support her and just like give her some money? I would be very delighted if you were to do that. And if you would like to do that, there's no pressure to do it because education should be free. And I'm delighted you're all here. But should you be thinking, what if I wanted to just throw some money at Shuli Elisheva? Well, you can go to a website called Ko-fi, ko-fi.com/Shuli Elisheva. And you can buy me a glace latte, a glass of tea for $3. And I may or may not buy a glass of tea with it. You can buy me 6 of them. That's 18. Hi. You can make a one-time donation or a monthly donation. I am a single mother. I have been struggling financially this year, but I really love teaching people. And so any support that you can give me would enable me to help, would enable me to continue teaching people, and not only my paid students, but doing things like this, teaching people for free, because education should be free and not everybody can afford to pay for education. So ko-fi, ko-fi.com/Shuli Elisheva, and my website, creativeshuli.com. There's a whole Yiddish tab here. If you like the live action Aladdin, I wrote a Yiddish parody of one of the songs from Aladdin. Lots of fun. Actually, it's pretty serious and depressing, but there it is. So that being said, I would like to open things up now to question and answer. So I'm going to stop my screen share here, and I'm going to head over to the chat box, and I invite you now either to go send me money at ko-fi.com, and or head over to the chat box and send me some questions or comments or complaints or anything that you want to send. And let's have a conversation. So I said the first thing I was going to do is the spelling. So while people are writing things in here, let me open up my whiteboard again. And so what I'm going to do here now is, so if you read Yiddish, we'll do some transliteration as well. But a word, for example, like Zeyer in YIVO Yiddish is spelled with 2 yuds, Zeyer. In Hasidic Yiddish, the 2 yuds is often pronounced I. And the way that you would have an A sound is with an ayin and often a hey as well, Zeyer. There are often silent letters in Hasidic Yiddish. So for example, something like ir, which means her, in YIVO Yiddish, in Hasidic Yiddish would be oftentimes with a hey, with a silent hey. And the reason why there are these spelling differences is because part of the ideological agenda of YIVO Yiddish was to separate Yiddish from German. A lot of people thought, oh, Yiddish is just bad German. And the creators of YIVO Yiddish wanted to make it clear, no, we're different, we're our own language. But the Hasidim didn't do that. And that's a whole story about the so-called Deutschmerisms and how YIVO Yiddish called certain words fake, and the Hasidim were using those words, and then they called neologisms from YIVO fake and all these things. But in German, if you know German, then you would know that the equivalent of Zeir is spelled with an H, right? The equivalent of Ir is spelled with an H. And so in Hasidic Yiddish, and basically in most Yiddish before YIVO Yiddish, the H was maintained as a hey. The H was maintained. And so sometimes you'll also have silent alepphs, and you might have silent, all sorts of silent letters for that reason. The other big spelling difference has to do with names. And the big difference with names is that in Hasidic Yiddish, names that end with an A sound will generally be spelled with an aleph. So for example, my mother's name in Yiddish is, let me just put this here. So Elka, Ayin Lamed Kuf Aleph. Well, in YIVO Yiddish, it would be spelled with an ayin, Elka. And this actually goes back, this isn't a recent thing. In the Talmud, there are discussions of how you should spell Aramaic names and names from other languages that don't come from Hebrew. And the decision in the Talmud is that if there's a name that doesn't come from Hebrew, ending with an A sound, you spell it with an aleph at the end. But in YIVO Yiddish, they decided it should be with an ayin. So that's another point of tension, and this comes up a lot. I was married to a rabbi for 10 years, and my spouse, the rabbi, would get requests all the time for how do you spell my relative's name on a gravestone? I know their name was this, but I've never seen it spelled. How do you spell it? Like this is always a question. Do you spell it with an aleph or do you spell it with an ayin? It actually has very personal ramifications in contexts like that. So good. Stop the share, go back to the chat. Do you think that summer intensive YIVO 6-week program that is online this summer is super worth it? That's a great question. And I would say in general, yes, it's worth it. I know people who have done it and learned a huge amount. But what I would say is that I would relate to you a parable that I read many years ago. If you're a classical piano nerd like I am, and you know the famous piano teacher Heinrich Neuhaus, who taught many of the great Russian pianists, he related this parable in one of his books that I read in college. He says, imagine a person is traveling by foot. They're traveling from one place to another. And they're on their way, and this is before iPhones, before GPS. And they see a stranger, and the stranger looks like they know what's going on. And so the traveler goes over to the stranger and says, excuse me, how long would it take me to walk from here to such and such city? And the stranger says, walk. And the traveler thinks that maybe the stranger just didn't hear and repeats the question, how long would it take me to walk from here to such and such city? And the stranger says, walk. And now the traveler is getting very upset. He thinks that the stranger is mocking him. And he asks one more time, how long will it take me to walk from here to this city? And again, the stranger says, walk. And the traveler gets so upset that he just storms away with great big steps, really fast. And then from behind him, the stranger calls out, 45 minutes. And the traveler turns around and he says, what? And the stranger says, 45 minutes. It should take you about 45 minutes to walk there. And the traveler says, why didn't you just tell me that the first time? And the stranger says, well, how could I tell you how long it would take if I hadn't yet seen how you were going to walk, right? And the point is that how you learn depends on how you learn, right? And there are ways to study that are very effective, ways that aren't. There are teaching methods that work really, really well for some people that don't work really well for other people. Some people are visual learners. Some people are more auditory learners. Some people learn by doing things, whereas other people learn by being sponges and soaking everything up. So The short of it is, yes, YIVO summer program is a fantastic program. There's a good reason why it's so famous and so well known and so beloved. But it's important to understand that what program you choose isn't the only important thing, right? It also matters how you're going to learn. So that may not be the answer you were looking for, but I think it's important to always keep in mind. All right, so let's see what else. Thank you so much. I would love to send you a tea. Thank you, Sadie. I really like peppermint tea, and lately I've been orange tea. But that we'll talk about that another time, perhaps. Okay. Jenny, thank you for putting the coffee link in there. What kind of music do you compose? I compose mostly piano music, and I mostly compose the sort of music you would hear in a fantasy or sci-fi movie. If you go to my website, I actually have a bunch of things on there. Actually, if any of you know Yiddish Pop, Yiddish Pop is a fantastic website where you can watch cartoons in Yiddish and learn Yiddish at the same time. But there's a problem with it. The biggest problem with Yiddish Pop is that there's no background music. And as I have a PhD in musicology, I used to teach music theory at Brown University, and so like I used to write a blog about the music theory of Disney music. So like I'm always thinking about music, and I decided that Yiddish Pop needs music, so I actually wrote background music for one of the episodes of Yiddish Pop, the one about ice cream, if you know it. So you can actually go on YouTube and you can find this episode of Yiddish Pop with my own background music. Makes it very intense, very dramatic, because I'm a very intense and dramatic kind of person. So yeah, so I do that, and I mostly like fantasy sci-fi type stuff. So confused about the vowel sound in the following words in Yiddish: blue, woman, brown, house, rose, etc. About the vowel sound in the following words. So blo, fro. So this in standard Yiddish would be bloy, froy, broin, hois, rois. And whereas in Duolingo Yiddish and Samar Yiddish, it would be blo, fro, hoz, or it would be blue, fru, whose, ruse. So sometimes u, sometimes o. I'm not sure how Duolingo pronounces these specific words. I know in the Hasidic world, there's some say blo, some say blue, but if you'd like to elaborate on that question, I would be happy to talk more about it. If anyone lives in the Chicago area, says Josh, there are Yiddish courses offered through the Workers Circle and YIVO there. If you are really interested in farming, there is a program called Yiddish Farm, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is a farm where you can go and live on a farm where everybody speaks Yiddish. And I recommend it. I am not into outdoorsy things myself, so I would probably hate it there. But I have friends who, within a few weeks, were speaking comfortably in Yiddish because you have to. There's also a summer program called Yiddish Woche, which is only 1 week long. It's sponsored by Jugendruf, which is basically 1 week in the Catskills. It's like a combination of a children's summer camp and an academic conference and a family retreat. And the one rule is that everybody speaks Yiddish. So I've gone to that a number of times and couldn't speak with anybody in the beginning. And it was very frustrating, but that's largely how I became fluent. So yes, there are a lot of different summer things that you can do and a lot of things online. Wow, that's also my mom's name. Oh, Elka, nice name. Gela, hi Gela, nice to see you. Spelled with an aleph at the end. Warsaw, way less expensive option. So depending on where you are in the world, Warsaw, there's also a program in Vilna. There's also a program in Tel Aviv. Oh, I see Gela. People keep telling me it should be Gela with an I in, right? We used to sing in a Yiddish choir together, and I still remember the director one day talking about the color yellow, and which is standard Yiddish gel, and in other dialects, like Duolingo Yiddish, Gail. And I remember the director saying, "Oh, Gala, like yellow, like Gala's name." That was pretty funny. Colloquialisms on Zoom are annoying, just as, for example, they suggest that Efshar could mean please. Where did they get this stuff? I'm not going to tell you how many times I angered Chassidim because I used the word shkoyach to mean well done or congratulations, because in Hasidic Yiddish, shkoyach only means thank you. But outside the Hasidic world, it rarely means thank you. So yes, word choice is definitely a major distinction among the different, and it's not just in Yiddish. You know, I've teased with my friends all the time about soda versus pop, or why are you calling this a Coke if it's a Pepsi? A Pepsi can't be a Coke, you know, things like that. And my uncle from New York used to tease me that I would say humid and he says humid. I say humid, he says humid. So it's a lot of spaß, a lot of teasing going on. Speaking of wie wohnt in an Ananas hinter den Yam? Speaking of sponges, yes, there was recently somebody was posting about this screen in Duolingo. Who lives in a pineapple under the sea? SpongeBob SquarePants. After is maybe in the sense that maybe you could wait a little means please wait a little. It has a lot of different meanings. Yeah, a lot of these words have different. Deborah says, I swear they say fro instead of froy. Yes, fro instead of froy. And in the Hasidic world, some people will say fru instead of froy. Sadie, private message, great. Froy in Duolingo is fro. What is JTS? Did somebody mention JTS?
Accidentally, it's not relevant. They're offering Hebrew, not Yiddish.
Okay, great. YIVO branch sister group called I'm very embarrassed by not being able to pronounce this because I always feel like I should be able to. But there is a branch sister group in Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires actually became one of the great centers of Yiddish after the Holocaust. In fact, this fantasy book I mentioned that I just started reading, called On the Eve of the World War IV, Queen of Mars, was published in Buenos Aires, and the characters have Spanish names. So if you're interested in that, I can send you recommendations for Yiddish literature that actually has lots of Spanish in it because it was written in Buenos Aires. JTS is the Conservative Rabbinical School in New York City. Yes, I was pricing out its Hebrew course accidentally. Okay. Farm, Michville Farm, and okay, I'm gonna put here, it's called Yiddish Farm, and Yiddish Farm. I actually was there when the founders signed their constitution for Yiddish Farm. It was at the home of, I believe it was Naftali Edelman in New York City, in Riverdale, and they called it the Door Party because they also were installing a door in their apartment, and they were listening to music by the Doors while they were signing this document making official their Yiddish Farm project. So some things you never forget. Yes, please, on the Yiddish-Spanish combo. Great. So I will put some suggestions in here. Are there any other questions or anything at all that anybody would like to share? The family camp in the Catskills is called Yiddish Woch, and it's run by, the organization is called Jugendruf, which is a organization that was created in the 80s, I think 70s or 80s, with the purpose of supporting youth who speak Yiddish. Just wondering how YIVO academics react to the Duolingo course. It's arranged, so I guess I consider myself a Yiddishist, an academic, sort of. But my take is generally much more flexible than most Yiddishists. But I have friends who I actually really appreciate what Duolingo did. There are so many places to learn how to speak with the YIVO Yiddish accent, and there are not a lot of places, and so it's kind of time that we have something for Hasidic Yiddish. But I have friends who are furious about it, like really furious about it, and it just makes me so sad because it doesn't have to be this way, right? There doesn't have to be so much tension, and there's no single right way to speak any language, right? So the more dialects you're familiar with, the better. I never understood why people are so proud to only have one dialect or to only be monolingual. It doesn't make sense to me. Also, folks, check out the new textbook In Einem, which was published by the Yiddish Book Center. If you don't know of the Yiddish Book Center, definitely check them out. They have digitized thousands and thousands of Yiddish books that are available for free online. They also do summer programs. That's where I first learned Yiddish in 2009. Highly recommend it. Great. Let me just grab the name of this Yiddish writer from Buenos Aires, and then I will put it in the chat, and then I will let you all go. Let's see. I'm just Googling. Actually, you know what? Let me screen share this because you'll see the Yiddish Book Center website. Google Chrome. Erev Vetter Welt. Here it is. Hines. Kennigan von Mars. So this is written by Chernovetsky, Velvo Chernovetsky. And the main character's name is Hinesita. So Hines for short. And I guess she becomes the Queen of Mars. This is also a very funny book because it takes place in 1999, imagining what the world will be like in 1999. So highly recommended. All right, great. Well, Ashenim Dank and sei gesund. And I always say this past year, sei gesund, be healthy, both idiomatically and also literally. I see that we're coming out of the pandemic, hopefully very, very soon, though it's still up in the air, and I hope that everybody is safe and healthy. And if you would like to be in touch, you can contact me anytime, creativeshuli@gmail.com. I am also on Twitter, Shuli Elisheva, and I'm on Instagram, Shuli_Elisheva. I'm also on Facebook. Feel free to find me, and I look forward to talking with you another time, and I wish you all the best with your Yiddish. Bye.